The relentless afternoon sun beat down like a blacksmith's hammer against the unforgiving terrain of the jagged valley, baking the cracked earth into a suffocating mosaic of dust and sharp shale. In the heart of this desolate expanse, a deafening symphony of chaos erupted, shattering the eerie silence that had previously swallowed the landscape. A highly trained element of elite Navy SEALs, men who had spent their entire adult lives mastering the art of warfare, found themselves violently pinned down in a textbook L-shaped ambush. The enemy had the high ground, a concealed heavy machine gun tearing through the air and chewing the rocks to jagged splinters all around them. The operators were trapped in the kill zone, their momentum completely shattered by an invisible adversary dictating the terms of their survival. Amidst the suffocating smoke, the flying debris, and the desperate shouted commands, a quiet female attachment to the team shifted her weight into the dirt. Just days prior, these same seasoned warriors had openly laughed at her presence, their dismissive chuckles echoing in the briefing room as they questioned what a quiet woman could possibly contribute to their kinetic world. Now, she steadied her breathing, her eye aligning perfectly behind the scope of her rifle, tuning out the chaos and focusing solely on the math of the impending shot. What does it take to silence a room of elite warriors who think you do not belong? Have you ever had to prove your worth without saying a single word, letting your actions speak volumes in a moment of absolute crisis? Sarah's journey into the shadows of special operations was not paved with invitations or warm welcomes. It was forged in the quiet, agonizing fires of relentless discipline and unbreakable willpower. Growing up in the rugged foothills of the Pacific Northwest, she had learned early on that respect was never freely given. It was something carefully carved out of hardship. Her father, a stoic veteran of a bygone era, had taught her how to stalk deer in the freezing rain, instructing her on the sacred mechanics of the rifle, the importance of reading the wind, and the undeniable truth that the wilderness does not care about your gender, your ego, or your fears. When she enlisted in the military, she brought that icy pragmatism with her. Sarah was not the loudest recruit in the barracks, nor was she the one puffing her chest during grueling physical training sessions. Instead, she was the ghost in the ranks, the soldier who simply refused to quit, absorbing pain and exhaustion with a quiet, unnerving stoicism. She navigated the arduous pipeline of the military's most demanding intelligence and designated marksman programs, operating in spaces where women were historically absent and presently scrutinized. Every dropped ruck, every missed target, every sign of weakness would be amplified tenfold simply because she was different. Understanding this stark reality, Sarah adopted a philosophy of silent excellence. She understood that true leadership and perseverance do not always roar. Sometimes, they are the quiet, rhythmic sound of boots hitting the pavement long after everyone else has gone to sleep. The military structure is an unforgiving meritocracy, yet human bias often lingers like a thick fog in the hallways of elite units. As Sarah pushed through advanced marksmanship courses, mastering the complex geometry of long-range ballistics, she continually faced the subtle, exhausting friction of having to prove herself every single day. The men she trained alongside were exceptional, driven by the same patriotic fervor and desire to excel, but they were also a product of a deeply entrenched brotherhood. When she outperformed them on the firing line, calculating spin drift and Coriolis effect with the cold precision of a supercomputer, the reactions were rarely celebratory. They were met with quiet disbelief, followed by rationalizations that she had simply gotten lucky. However, luck is a fleeting commodity in the world of precision shooting. Sarah's consistency was born of thousands of hours spent in uncomfortable positions, her muscles cramping as she forced her heart rate to slow, learning to squeeze the trigger in the exact space between heartbeats. This grueling dedication instilled in her a profound resilience, a vital military value that teaches a soldier how to absorb external doubt and transform it into internal fuel. She learned that emotional control is just as critical as breath control, and that allowing the skepticism of others to penetrate her mind would only throw off her aim. She became a master of compartmentalization, building a fortress in her mind where only the mission, the data, and her duty resided. By the time she earned her place as an intelligence support attachment and designated marksman for Special Operations Task Forces, Sarah had evolved into a consummate professional. She possessed a unique, highly sought-after skill set, the ability to seamlessly blend the analytical prowess of an intelligence operative with the lethal, surgical precision of a sniper. Her role required her to interpret complex battlefield data, predict enemy movements, and, when necessary, provide overwatch and eliminate high-value threats from distances that defied the naked eye. Yet, despite her flawless record and the formidable arsenal of skills she had cultivated, she was about to step into an environment where her resume would mean absolutely nothing. True acceptance in the most elite echelons of the military cannot be earned on a paper certificate or a shooting range back home. It can only be won in the unforgiving crucible of combat, where the stakes are absolute and where the title of a quiet professional is tested by fire. Sarah knew this, and as she prepared for her next high-stakes deployment, she tightened her gear, silenced her doubts, and embraced the immense weight of the shadows she was about to step into. The atmosphere in the briefing room of Task Force Trident was thick with a potent mixture of caffeine, old sweat, and the aggressive, unyielding confidence of Tier 1 operators. Navy SEALs are famously insular, operating as a tightly knit tribe that relies on an unspoken, almost telepathic synergy forged through years of shared suffering in the surf and the sand. When Sarah was introduced to the platoon as their attached intelligence and Overwatch specialist for the upcoming deployment, the reception was exactly what she had anticipated. There was no open hostility, but rather a chilling, polite dismissal. As the platoon commander outlined her capabilities, detailing her role in bridging the gap between tactical intelligence and long-range engagement, a few of the seasoned operators exchanged subtle smirks. A heavy, collective chuckle rippled through the back of the room. It was not malicious, but it was profoundly patronizing. To these men, who had breached compounds under heavy fire and engaged in vicious close-quarters combat across the globe, the presence of a quiet, unassuming woman in their kinetic world felt like an unnecessary administrative mandate imposed by higher-ups who did not understand the savage realities of their job. They saw her as a liability to be protected, a fragile piece of glass that would inevitably shatter when the world around them exploded into violence. Sarah sat quietly in the corner of the room, her expression an unreadable mask of calm detachment. She did not rise to the bait, nor did she attempt to justify her presence with a passionate speech about her qualifications. One of the most critical lessons of military leadership is recognizing that respect cannot be demanded through words. It must be commanded through actions. Defending her ego in that room would only serve to validate their skepticism. Instead, she engaged in the briefing with surgical precision, asking highly technical, piercing questions about the target terrain, the infiltration routes, and the suspected enemy force disposition. She wanted to know the specific composition of the soil for her bipod, the historical weather patterns of the valley, and the atmospheric pressure variations at their intended elevation. For a brief second, the room grew quiet, the SEALs momentarily taken aback by the sheer depth of her tactical foresight. Yet, the moment passed, and the ingrained biases quickly reasserted themselves. They answered her questions with clipped professionalism, but their body language remained closed off, signaling clearly that she was in their house, operating strictly on their terms. Sarah accepted this reality without a trace of resentment. She understood the psychology of elite teams. Their skepticism was a defense mechanism, a vital survival instinct designed to protect the integrity of the unit against untested variables. In their eyes, she was the ultimate untested variable. During the pre-deployment workup, Sarah's isolation within the team remained palpable. She ate her meals alone, cleaned her weapon in silence, and executed her training drills with a robotic, flawless consistency that slowly began to unnerve a few of the younger operators. The military places a high premium on teamwork and cohesion, but true integration requires a shared vulnerability that the SEALs were unwilling to offer her. She was a ghost walking among giants, observing their dynamics, learning their standard operating procedures, and mapping out the complex interpersonal relationships within the platoon. She knew that when the bullets started flying, they would not be looking out for her. They would be looking out for each other, and they would expect her to hide. This knowledge did not demoralize her. It sharpened her focus to a razor's edge. She spent her nights calculating ballistic trajectories in the dark, visualizing the chaotic variables of the battlefield, and preparing her mind for the inevitable moment when everything would go wrong. She was not there to be their friend, nor was she there to seek their validation. She was there to do a job that required absolute emotional detachment and total physical control. The silence of the outsider can be a heavy burden, but Sarah wore it like armor, conserving her energy, refining her skills, and waiting patiently for the moment when the laughter would inevitably fade into the harsh, demanding reality of war. The deployment to the desolate, war-torn theater was a jarring transition from the sterile environment of training to the raw, unpredictable chaos of a combat zone. The task force was assigned a critical mission: to infiltrate a remote, highly fortified valley controlled by a notorious insurgent network and capture or eliminate a high-value facilitator who had been orchestrating complex attacks across the region. The valley was a nightmare of geographical features, characterized by towering, jagged ridgelines that funneled into narrow, fatal choke points. It was the kind of terrain that heavily favored the defender, offering countless blind spots, natural caves, and elevated perches that made an undetected approach nearly impossible. As the mission planning intensified in the cramped, humid confines of the Tactical Operations Center, the friction between Sarah and the SEAL element became a subtle undercurrent to the intense preparations. The primary plan involved a nighttime helicopter insertion miles away from the target, followed by a grueling foot patrol over punishing terrain to establish a cordon and overwatch before the main assault element breached the compound. Sarah's role was to move ahead of the main element, establish a concealed hide site on a commanding ridge, and provide critical intelligence and sniper overwatch for the assaulters below. The complexity of the mission required flawless coordination and a profound level of trust, a commodity that was still entirely absent between Sarah and the operators. During the final rehearsal of concept drill, the team leader, a hardened veteran named Miller, explicitly outlined his expectations. He made it abundantly clear that he did not expect Sarah to engage unless absolutely necessary. Her primary function, in his view, was merely to be a set of eyes on the objective, a passive observer while the real warriors handled the kinetic work. He cautioned her not to compromise their position and to stay out of the way if things went sideways. The underlying message was undeniable. They did not trust her finger on the trigger when lives were on the line. Rather than arguing, Sarah nodded respectfully, acknowledging the commander's intent. True military discipline is the ability to subordinate one's personal pride to the overarching objectives of the mission. She understood that challenging Miller's authority in front of his men would erode the fragile cohesion of the unit right before they stepped into the unknown. However, internally, she was meticulously reviewing her contingencies, calculating the angles of deflection, the barometric pressure of the valley, and the exact limits of her rifle's effective range. She knew that no plan survives first contact with the enemy, and when the inevitable chaos ensued, she would not be bound by their low expectations, but by her duty to keep them alive. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of purple and bruised orange, the task force moved to the flight line. The heavy, rhythmic thumping of the Chinook helicopters vibrated through their chests, a familiar, adrenaline-inducing heartbeat that signaled the point of no return. Sarah conducted her final gear checks with a ritualistic reverence. Every piece of equipment, from her laser rangefinder to the magazines loaded with match-grade ammunition, was secured and silenced. She applied camouflage paint to her face, erasing her identity and transforming herself into a shadow. As she boarded the helicopter and took her seat among the heavily armed SEALs, the contrast was stark. They were massive, physically imposing figures, communicating with hand signals and aggressive nods, while she sat quietly, a small, unassuming figure enveloped in darkness. Yet, beneath her quiet exterior burned a fierce, highly calibrated focus. She closed her eyes, visualizing the terrain map she had memorized, anticipating the drop in temperature, the shifting winds of the valley, and the potential enemy avenues of approach. The gathering storm of combat was imminent, and while the men around her prepared for a localized, close-quarters brawl, Sarah was mentally expanding her awareness, preparing to view the battlefield as a lethal chessboard where every variable could be manipulated by a single, perfectly timed intervention. The insertion was a masterclass in aggressive, stealthy infiltration. The heavy helicopters kissing the dirt for merely a few seconds before lifting off and leaving the operators engulfed in a suffocating cloud of dust and total darkness. As the dust settled and the deafening roar of the rotors faded into the distance, the oppressive silence of the hostile valley pressed down upon them. Through the green hue of their night vision goggles, the world was transformed into a monochromatic, spectral landscape. The task force immediately adopted their tactical formations, moving with a fluid, predatory grace over the uneven terrain. The physical toll of the patrol was immediate and brutal. The ground was composed of loose, treacherous shale that threatened to betray their position with every step, and the sheer elevation made every breath feel like drawing in shards of glass. Sarah moved with the lead element, carrying a massive rucksack and a heavy precision rifle that weighed nearly a third of her own body weight. Despite the excruciating burn in her lungs and the screaming fatigue in her legs, she maintained a flawless, silent pace, never once faltering or requesting a halt. Her ability to endure the physical torment without complaint was the first subtle crack in the SEAL's armor of skepticism. They noticed her endurance, though they said nothing, their focus entirely consumed by the perilous environment. As they navigated deeper into the valley, utilizing the deep shadows of the ravines to mask their approach, Sarah's highly attuned senses began to pick up on the subtle, alarming anomalies in the environment. The fundamental essence of situational awareness is not merely looking at the world, but actively reading it, discerning the baseline of an environment, and identifying when that baseline shifts. The valley was entirely too quiet. There were no stray dogs barking in the distance, no ambient sounds of nocturnal wildlife, and the few scattered structures they passed were entirely devoid of the normal heat signatures indicating sleeping occupants. It felt less like a valley and more like a carefully constructed funnel. Sarah signaled a halt, passing the information up to Miller. She pointed out the distinct lack of ambient activity and the strategic advantage of a rocky outcropping situated directly above their intended route. Miller, trusting his own extensive combat experience, acknowledged her observation but decided to press forward. The objective was time-sensitive, and altering their route would force them to cross an exposed ridgeline, an unacceptable risk in his calculus. He ordered the team to maintain their current heading, pushing them deeper into the narrow gorge that led to the target compound. Sarah tightened her grip on her rifle, a cold, sinking feeling taking root in her stomach. Her intelligence training screamed that they were walking into a prepared kill zone. Realizing that she could not alter the command decision, Sarah shifted her focus entirely to mitigation. As the team advanced, she deliberately altered her own vector, drifting slightly higher up the embankment to create a microscopic angle of offset from the main element. It was a subtle, highly technical tactical adjustment that required immense physical effort, forcing her to scramble up steep, jagged rocks while maintaining absolute silence. If the enemy were waiting, they would focus their attention on the largest concentration of movement on the valley floor, the center of mass. By creating lateral and vertical separation, Sarah was positioning herself outside the primary fatal funnel, establishing a tiny, critical sliver of space from which she could operate if the worst came to pass. The tension in the air was palpable, heavy, and suffocating, like the atmosphere right before a massive lightning strike. The operators moved with their weapons raised, scanning the high ground, their internal alarms blaring as they crossed the final threshold toward the target. Sarah found a temporary vantage point behind a massive boulder, deploying her bipod and scanning the dark ridges above with her thermal optic. Her breathing was slow, controlled, and rhythmic. She was no longer a quiet woman following a team of giants. She was a predator, patiently waiting for the invisible enemy to reveal their hand in the Valley of Shadows. The trap was sprung with a level of ferocity and coordination that instantly shattered the silence of the night, turning the dark valley into an absolute cauldron of noise, fire, and kinetic devastation. It did not begin with a single shot, but with a blinding, synchronized eruption of violence. A deafening barrage of heavy PKM machine gun fire ripped down from a perfectly concealed, elevated bunker on the eastern ridge. the bright green tracer rounds converging on the seal's position like a river of lethal fire. Almost simultaneously, the sharp, distinct cracks of enemy sniper fire echoed from a secondary position on the western slope, effectively creating a devastating crossfire that pinned the task force to the valley floor. The ground around the operators exploded into fragments of rock and blinding dust, the air instantly thick with the acrid stench of cordite and pulverized stone. Miller and his men reacted with the instantaneous, violent muscle memory born of 1,000 training drills, diving for whatever meager cover the shallow ditches and small rocks provided, returning a massive volume of suppressive fire into the darkness. But the enemy had the ultimate tactical advantage: superior elevation, hardened concealment, and the element of total surprise. The SEALs were trapped in a classic L-shaped ambush, their aggressive momentum entirely neutralized, unable to maneuver or break contact without sustaining catastrophic casualties. From her offset position slightly above the valley floor, Sarah remained completely untouched by the initial volley of fire. The chaos erupting just meters below her was terrifying, a sensory overload of shouting, explosions, and the terrifying supersonic snap of bullets cutting through the air. In a situation like this, the human brain's natural instinct is to panic, to freeze, or to fire wildly into the dark in a desperate bid for survival. But military discipline and years of grueling psychological conditioning kicked in, overriding her fear with a cold, analytical clarity. She did not open fire. Firing prematurely would only reveal her position to the enemy, drawing their heavy weapons toward her and eliminating the one tactical advantage the team had left: a hidden shooter. Instead, Sarah pressed her eye into the scope, her breathing deliberately slowing down as she mapped the battle space. She analyzed the trajectory of the enemy tracers, tracing the lethal beams of light back to their source. The enemy PKM gunner was deeply entrenched behind a narrow slit in a fortified rock wall, laying down a continuous, murderous sheet of plunging fire that was slowly chewing through the SEAL's cover. Worse, she identified the enemy sniper on the opposite ridge, who was systematically picking off the operator's communication equipment and preventing them from calling in close air support. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. It was a matter of minutes before the enemy maneuvered to flank and finish off the pinned element. Understanding that she had only seconds to alter the fate of the entire platoon, Sarah made a calculated decision. The enemy sniper was the immediate precision threat, but the PKM was the weapon keeping the SEALs completely suppressed. She had to eliminate the machine gunner first, but the target was almost entirely protected by the rock wall, leaving only a tiny, fleeting window of exposure when the gunner leaned into the weapon to fire. It was an impossibly small target, complicated by the steep upward angle, the swirling wind whipping through the gorge, and the immense pressure of the moment. Sarah adjusted her optic, dialing in the elevation to account for the steep incline. She checked the subtle movement of the dust in the air, calculating the wind value, and making a minor adjustment for spin drift. She was no longer thinking about the laughter in the briefing room, the skepticism of the men below her, or the immense danger she was in. She entered a state of absolute flow, a terrifyingly serene pocket of silence amidst the deafening roar of combat. She nestled the butt of the rifle firmly into her shoulder, her finger resting lightly on the trigger, waiting for the exact fraction of a second when the enemy gunner's rhythm would expose his position. The gathering storm had finally broken, and in the heart of the ambush, the quiet woman was about to speak. The heavy PKM machine gun ceased firing for a fraction of a second, the gunner pausing to realign his belt of ammunition. In that infinitesimal window of silence, Sarah found her sight picture. The crosshairs of her optics settled perfectly on the tiny, shadowed gap in the rock wall, directly in line with the enemy's position. She exhaled smoothly, pausing naturally at the bottom of her breath, letting her heart rate settle into a slow, rhythmic thump. The chaotic world around her vanished, leaving only the complex mathematical equation of distance, wind, gravity, and the target. With a smooth, deliberate motion, she applied pressure to the trigger. The rifle bucked violently against her shoulder, a massive tongue of fire erupting from the muzzle, the suppressed crack of the magnum round cutting through the air like a localized thunderclap. The bullet traveled across the valley at nearly 3,000 feet per second, slicing through the crosswinds, its trajectory a perfect, deadly arc. The impact was instantaneous and devastating. The round threaded the needle of the rock barricade, striking the heavy gunner with catastrophic precision. The machine gun instantly fell silent, the lethal stream of green tracers abruptly vanishing from the night sky, creating a sudden, shocking void in the enemy's overwhelming volume of fire. The immediate cessation of the plunging fire completely altered the physics of the battlefield. For the SEALs pinned on the valley floor, the sudden silence from the primary threat was a lifeline thrown into the abyss. Recognizing the shift in momentum, Miller bellowed an order, and the operators surged upward, unleashing a synchronized, devastating barrage of fire on the secondary enemy positions. But Sarah was not finished. She smoothly cycled the bolt of her rifle, the spent brass casing ejecting into the dirt as she immediately pivoted her weapon toward the western ridge. She rapidly acquired the heat signature of the enemy sniper, who was momentarily disoriented by the sudden collapse of their primary gunner. Without hesitation, she adjusted her holdover and pressed the trigger a second time. Another suppressed crack echoed off the canyon walls, and the enemy sniper's rifle dropped from the ledge, neutralizing the crossfire entirely. In the span of less than 10 seconds, utilizing 2 flawlessly executed shots, Sarah had completely dismantled a perfectly orchestrated ambush. The tactical brilliance of her actions allowed the SEAL element to violently assault through the kill zone, overwhelming the remaining disorganized enemy fighters and securing the perimeter. The suffocating pressure that had trapped them was gone, replaced by the aggressive, controlled dominance of an elite task force that had just been given a second lease on life. As the dust began to settle and the adrenaline slowly ebbed from the atmosphere, the reality of what had just transpired washed over the platoon. They secured their casualties, treated their minor wounds, and established a defensive posture, waiting for the extraction helicopters. Sarah quietly descended from her elevated perch, her rifle slung over her shoulder, moving with the same unassuming silence she had maintained since the day she arrived. She did not seek out praise, nor did she posture for recognition. She simply moved to her designated sector and continued to pull security. However, as Miller and his men gathered their bearings, their eyes naturally drifted toward her. The dismissive smirks were entirely gone, replaced by a profound, heavy realization. They had walked into a fatal trap, and the very person they had openly mocked, the quiet woman they had deemed a liability, had just single-handedly saved their lives through a display of unparalleled tactical mastery and ice-cold composure. There were no immediate apologies or dramatic speeches, for military men of their caliber rarely trade in such sentimentalities in the immediate aftermath of a gunfight. Instead, there was a quiet, profound shift in their demeanor. When Miller walked past her to check the perimeter, he paused for a fraction of a second, caught her eye in the darkness, and gave a slow, definitive nod of absolute respect. The laughter had been permanently silenced, not by an argument, but by the undeniable, echoing truth of a single, perfect shot. The journey back to the forward operating base was shrouded in a heavy, contemplative silence. The rhythmic beating of the helicopter blades serving as the only soundtrack to their collective reflection. Sarah sat in the same seat she had occupied hours earlier, her face still covered in camouflage paint, her expression as unreadable and stoic as ever. Yet, the energy within the aircraft had fundamentally transformed. The invisible barrier that had separated her from the elite brotherhood of the SEAL platoon was gone, shattered by the brutal, undeniable truth of combat. They had learned a profound and humbling lesson that night. Capability does not possess a gender, excellence does not require a loud voice. And the greatest warriors are often the ones who speak the least, but deliver the most when the entire world is collapsing around them. Sarah had not merely survived the crucible. She had controlled it, proving that true leadership and value in the military are defined entirely by action, discipline, and the quiet refusal to let the doubt of others dictate your potential. Sarah's story stands as a powerful testament to the essence of the quiet professional. In a world that often rewards the loudest voice in the room, her journey serves as a reminder that true confidence is silent, while insecurities are loud. She endured the prejudice, the laughter, and the exhausting isolation not by complaining, but by fiercely dedicating herself to mastering her craft, knowing that eventually the battlefield would strip away all biases and demand only pure competence. Her first shot did not just stop an ambush and save the lives of her teammates. It shattered a glass ceiling built on outdated perceptions, demanding a new standard of respect. Ultimately, Sarah Hayes proved that the most defining moments of our lives are not determined by how others view us, but by the relentless preparation and unbreakable courage we draw upon when we are called to step into the shadows and take the shot.